And then Jaskier and Geralt have this weird like fight that feels really forced after the Gold Dragon. And then they kind of like split ways, and that's kind of used to make this awkward kind of. The Witcher Season 2 recently came out, and it gave me a lot of feelings. Having something exist in so many different mediums is kind of odd to begin with. It isn't uncommon these days, I suppose, but it feels strange in this case for me. There are, of course, three main adaptations these days of the Witcher world, or at least the popular ones. There's the video games, the books, and the recent Netflix TV show. Although that doesn't really even begin to cover the breadth of adaptations across the franchise that now exist. There are comics, there's a tabletop RPG, there's an anime, there's a much older Polish adaptation, there are card games. And after having experienced Geralt of Rivia and the world of The Witcher in three kind of popular adaptations, my monkey brain needs them to be compared. There is a glaring issue with each of these being in different mediums. They're going to be kind of incomparable in certain ways because they have their own different approaches and methods of storytelling baked into whatever form that they're presented in, which is why it's best to compare these kind of as broadly as possible and accept that this isn't going to be a list for everyone because it's going to have, personal biases and preferences. Starting off with narrative, across all of the Witcher novels, the narrative is fragmented for the purposes of presentation. Kind of less so after the short stories, but still somewhat. It splits between Yennefer, Ciri, and Geralt, leaning more towards Ciri and Geralt. In fact, I really like the idea of creating a world through the singular lens of a Witcher as shown in the disconnected short stories before then jumping into the more traditional novelized saga that has like multiple perspectives. I think that's kind of a neat way to have done it, and that's how they did it in the books, and it kind of works really well. There are central arcs that carry over from the short stories to the novels, each of which are kind of remain interesting, but maintain enough loose focus on certain elements to stay interesting and narratively engaging. I might be alone in this, but I think that some of the most engaging narrative works in the books happens in the short stories and then pays off in the saga itself. For example, Something More and kind of exploring the destiny that ties Geralt and Ciri, which is very well done in the books and then kind of handled interestingly in the show. Most of the narrative throughout the books are emotive and interesting enough to draw you along. To begin the discussion about the Netflix show, I should probably mention that narrative fidelity and being accurate to the original is not that important to me. I don't think that an adaptation should be necessarily beholden to what it's adapting from. The Witcher Netflix is one such adaptation where it kind of takes its own narrative threads and runs with them. And reimagines certain things. The showrunners and the writers should take the artistic liberties when adapting. However, I feel that the narrative of The Witcher Netflix show actively lacks depth compared to the novel counterparts. The show accomplishes its world building through exposition and minor narrative arcs in the first season in the same way that the early short stories do, with their own deviations. In the show, in the first season and second season, they focus on Ciri, Geralt, and Yennefer, often having to create entirely new scenes for Yennefer and Ciri. This gives an insight into the kind of show that the showrunners want to make. This is unfortunately its greatest weakness, particularly in season 1. The presentation of the world and events resemble cheap fiction that you might find in the back of a dusty bookshop with poorly drawn, kind of overly grim fantasy landscapes on the cover. That's kind of the aesthetic that it almost feels like in the first season, and it doesn't really help that in the second season it kind of is bogged down in kind of just bad fantasy writing. An example that comes to mind is when Yennefer comes to grips with the fact that the sorceresses of Aretuza turn the unaccomplished mages into eels to power the magical school. This is an interesting departure from the presentation of Aretuza in the books. It feels really nonsensical almost, and it's only explained and presented by the outside of the magical school having lights come on as if the magical eel-powered electricity was running low. I think what they were trying to do with scenes such as this is they were trying to create their own versions and situations of moral grayness, which is very present in the Witcher games and books, and it's kind of well presented largely in those. This is not so much. Like, it tries to obviously discuss things like the inescapability of violence in certain scenes, and it just fully falls flat because the presentation and writing just isn't on par with the previous works or adaptations. So let's get a bit more positive with The Witcher 3 as a adaptation, more like a continuation, but for the purposes of this, it's an adaptation. Witcher 3 has the benefit of a more dynamic narrative that can be woven and molded by the players, both negative and positive in some ways. The negatives are that a lot of the narrative quality takes dips from the source material. It's difficult to have a game where you can have multiple outcomes and for all of them to be narratively effective or cohesive in the same way that a linear book is. Unlike the novels and the Netflix show, Witcher 3 has an entirely different narrative because it's more of a continuation than a true adaptation of the story of the books. This makes it feel slightly disconnected, and there are like new threads that come up and disappear randomly. For example, there are like entire characters and story arcs from The Witcher 2 that are like missing and never referenced in Witcher 3. The main story of The Witcher 3 largely follows Geralt's journey to find Ciri and protect her from the Wild Hunt. Many of the narrative moments are engaging and emotional, ultimately hampered by the game's open world nature somewhat, because it feels like the sense of urgency to find Ciri is downplayed by the constant need to play Gwent with every NPC. This kind of hampers the narrative pacing, but it being a video game, that's kind of up to the player to whether they're really engaged with the narrative in that way. This is further kind of disrupted by the weak and rushed conclusion of the main story, as the plot points kind of converge rather quickly, and the game ultimately concludes with Ciri facing a malevolent force, the White Frost, with little explanation for how she's confronting this. Despite these issues, the narrative and sub-narratives presented through side quests are told fairly compellingly, so it kind of offsets the nature of the main plot ending in kind of a weak way. One thing that comes to mind is the Bloody Baron questline. I mean, that's probably touted as being one of the best side quest chains in any games. While it does not have the narrative complexity, obviously, of the Witcher books, The Witcher 3 is kind of capable and very adept at making these moments of depth and immersive storytelling, especially through its ability to engage the player with the story, because you can actively change it, and that's really effective when you're talking about, you know, aspects of moral ambiguity. It's really fun to explore from the point of view of a player. Next, we'll look at dialogue. Sapkowski's novels were originally in Polish, and while English translations exist and they're pretty prevalent, there's obviously certain pieces of the prose that have lost meaning in the translation, largely leading to some of the book passages, especially the philosophical musings that Geralt tends to go on, kind of feel weird and they kind of ramble, but I assume it makes more sense in the original Polish. Me having never read the Polish versions, I can't really say much more than that the dialogue often works and sometimes feels like rambling philosophy that doesn't really go anywhere other than just saying destiny. Dialogue is perhaps one of the weakest points in the Netflix Witcher series. It is at best typically campy in that high fantasy dialogue kind of way that gives you the idea of the tone they're going for.
Filavandrel's loot not gift enough for you.
Yeah, she is a bit sexy, isn't she?
And at worst, it's confusing padding to fill out screen time in the worst way possible. And it's just awkward to watch.
Sorry.
You big old tool almost broke my toe.
The most memorable time that this falls flat is during the final episode of Season 1 of The Witcher, in which Yennefer has a conversation with a peasant who is stringing a bow. Yennefer listens to the peasant's sad backstory before turning a feather into 3, handing it to the peasant, who exclaims,
I wish I could do that.
To which Yennefer stares blankly at her and states,
It's magic. It's not real.
Who knows what that means? It's times like this when the TV show feels nonsensical and as if it's just reaching for something that it can't really achieve or doesn't understand, I suppose. The novels and the games have their examples of weak dialogue, but there are very few times in the Witcher games or the books when I was reading something and I just felt confused and anachronistic, but that was like my entire experience with season 1 and 2 of The Witcher. Even in season 2, when, you know, the quality is a little bit better in some regards, the dialogue more often than not is just meaningless and fails to even characterize or progress the plot.
What? I made new friends. Get over it. Jealous?
The dialogue in the Witcher games is really good, on the other hand. I did mention that there are weak parts, and in like a game where there are thousands of lines of dialogue, there's obviously going to be some weaker parts. but honestly in The Witcher 3, dialogue is one of its stronger points. This can probably be largely attributed to its RPG nature, as an unfortunate product of the sheer volume of spoken and written lines when compared to a TV show or a book. There is very little dialogue that is memorable, but when you're in those moments and listening to, for example, the way that the Bloody Baron is describing his relationship with his wife, or when Geralt is talking to the children in Crookback Bog, it's very difficult not to be fully engaged with what they're talking about. And at no point do you feel, this feels really anachronistic and like they wouldn't be saying that, unlike every line of dialogue that Jaskier says. Dandelion, on the other hand, just feels appropriately annoying, and like he hits all the right beats, and he never feels like he's saying things that a character in that setting would say. Rather nicely, all three versions of the Witcher adaptations all focus on one main character. Three main characters. The Witcher games pretty much ignore the perspective of Ciri and Yennefer until Witcher 3, when those two characters are actually brought into the narrative. But for the purposes of ease, the main focus of discussing characters will be Geralt, Ciri, and Yennefer. Sorry, Triss stands, but she's not massive in the books or the show, really. The games really focus on Geralt and Ciri, but they do explore some of Yennefer. Obviously, she's not like a playable character in the same way that Geralt and Ciri are in Witcher 3. As such, there isn't much growth for her as a character. In fact, there's probably not much growth for Geralt or Ciri either. It's a very static characterization. They obviously learn things, but you can't say that Geralt at the start of Witcher 3 is a different person from Geralt at the end of Witcher 3, or even the same for Ciri, really. That being said, there are a lot of really strong side characters that are fully engaging, and they do seem to have this kind of characterization and this building of character as the game goes on. For example, the big man, the Bloody Baron, Philip Stranger himself, Jarl Udalric, Sarasan Crate, Letho of Gullet, a character coming from Witcher 2, seems to have a pretty good characterization as well, especially in Witcher 2. Olgierd von Everec, probably the best example of that. On that last one, great summation of the way that The Witcher 3 explores character is the entire Hearts of Stone questline, which is kind of just exploring Olgierd as a character, but also Gauntlet Dim as a concept, which kind of gives the players the tools to either forgive Olgierd with his flaws and all, or condemn him and punish him for the things that he's done. So The Witcher 3 handles characters really well, in my opinion, other than the main cast being static and not really evolving or changing at all. That's just how it be. The books do a good job of creating and presenting characters, but it cannot be denied that some of the best ones are very underrepresented in the books. Vesemir, Neneke, Lambert, and Cahir are a few excellent characters that aren't really given enough page time. Much of that time is given to Geralt, and weirdly in the books the constant challenges to his morals just leave him feeling tired by the end of the series, so he doesn't really change too much in the books either. It's all very effective and appropriate. My only complaint is that they kind of retread a lot of ground with Geralt overcoming prejudice for monsters about 300 times over the course of the books and short stories. Stuff that didn't really need to be covered, but is effective when it does happen well. The show is a whole nother kettle of fish. They do something well, which is that Geralt kind of feels like a mashup of the game version and the book version.
Very similar to Doug Cockle's amazing work. And I had a look at it, had a listen to it, and I thought, actually, they are different enough. It's clearly inspired by.
Probably because of Henry Cavill carrying that show, which must be heavy for him. So it's hard to fault the show's Geralt. He feels soft towards Ciri in a fatherly way, and then emotionless and sarcastic towards most others, which works really well. Ciri is mostly well played by Freya Allen, especially in the second season. Her progression in both seasons is well written enough, even though the events surrounding her are really stupid most of the time. Perhaps the weakest aspect of the Netflix's series is that they never really nail her willful and stubborn nature. Another disappointing aspect of her character in the show is that her relationship with Yennefer is completely different, arguably a more important relationship than that with Geralt, and it's kind of absent or just completely changed. By all means, change and adapt the plots as you see fit, but it shows a consistent issue where Yennefer is the weakest link in the show's portrayal. It's important for an adaptation to change from the source material, or you're just retelling the same story but in a different medium. But you really need to make sure the parts of the story that you're replacing are as good or on a similar level as the adaptation. or else there's this really strong sense of dissonance between the two. This is present in The Witcher Season 1 and especially the Season 2 where they really get into changing things. It's almost solely surrounding Yennefer's storyline. Anyway, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I do have a few other things to touch on Yennefer's character and by extension her characterization in the Netflix show. Because it's just awful beyond belief. Everyone in her storyline acts irrationally, especially her, abandoning reason for no particular reason at all. There is a scene in Season 2 that kind of sums this all up, both from a writing and character perspective. In this scene, Yennefer decides that she's going to make herself look like a Nilfgaardian spy in front of all the kings of the Northern Realms and the entire conclave of mages for no particular reason other than that she just didn't want to kill a prisoner of war. Yennefer then proceeds to cut a metal chain with an executioner's axe, then escape by spilling a bit of fire. Not only is this a ridiculous notion that she could or would do any of these things based on what they've shown up to this point in the show, but it's also established that she has no magic at this time, so the malnourished, tortured Cahir and her just kind of run away from the conclave of mages and the kings of the Northern Realms, and they get away. Okay. Then in the next scene, they're incognito in the streets of a city, and Yennefer's wearing a massive purple cloak in the middle of a city bathed in mud and beige. Okay. Ultimately, predominant themes of the Witcher books are destiny and the spectrum of morality. There are others, but these kind of stand out the most, or at least they are given the most time on screen or on the page. In this respect, the book is adapted quite faithfully by the Netflix show as it maintains much of its focus on these themes. Meanwhile, the games, due to them having a different chronology within the story taking place after the books, are far less focused on the theme of destiny. It does come up, but it's not really that important to the whole thing. There is still an ever-present moral ambiguity, and it's maybe even jacked up to 11 in the games because they can explore it in every facet, even in side quests. There are small reoccurring themes in the Witcher games as well that are kind of departures from the books and the show. For example, the theme of there being power and importance in the actions of emotion. This is something that is present in the books, but seems to be left out of the Netflix show almost entirely. In the game, this theme often comes up when exploring curses. For example, the Hymn quest curse, the Bloody Baron questline, much of the Hearts of Stone DLC. The themes are far more sparse in the games, which is why I would argue that this is the weakest part of Witcher 3 as an adaptation. However, it is undeniable that the few inclusions that are there do feel very resonant when they come up. And of course the books win out for sticking to the themes that Sapkowski originally wove into the world and the characters. Most plot points and perspectives in the book are grounded in both major themes and executed quite well. The only point at which the book stumbles in this regard is the overly long strings of dialogue about philosophical musings that often are either poorly translated or get a bit too much. Before going on to the conclusion, it is worth looking at the context of each of these mediums and kind of what is out around each of them in terms of like competition. The Witcher 3 is an easy one because it's often lauded as one of the best or better AAA RPG titles. Although, to take a more realistic view of things, Witcher 3 is a great game, but a flawed RPG. In terms of its narrative choices, it ranks amongst the best with like Mass Effect, but in terms of its role-playing mechanics, it leaves a lot to be desired. But I think the skill tree and the role-playing gameplay elements don't really stack up against something like even Skyrim, which isn't that good either. You can't truly roleplay when there are 3 basic skill trees that are quite shallow, and little to no gameplay variety options beyond being better with signs or swords. Regardless of this lackluster aspect, it's kind of made up for in every other facet of the game. So in its context, it ranks highly, but it's definitely not above critique. The novels are slightly more difficult because their contemporaries are somewhat vaguer and couched in European culture. It does what most Eurocentric fantasy does and presents creative elements based largely on folklore and local myth. As much as Sapkowski seems to think his books are successful outside of Europe, having nothing to do with CD Projekt Red's games, they've certainly never been as lucrative as Brandon Sanderson, George R. R. Martin, Stephen King, Rowling, Gaiman, Robin Hobb, or even the uncountable other number of highly sought-after fiction writers in the upper echelons of fantasy. What I'm trying to get at is that based on the book's merits alone, without any of its adaptations, they create a very interesting world, but are fairly middling within the medium of fantasy novels. They certainly don't stack up against some of the better fantasy writing that is out there. The show is an easy one to place within its context because it's so kind of modern and contemporary. It is certainly more popular than I would have suspected, despite all its blemishes, but it is undeniably lower in quality than other fantasy adaptations. Much, if not all, of Game of Thrones is better than The Witcher Season 1 and 2, even Season 8. Shadow and Bone is a really good example because it's even a Netflix show that is more well received and clearly of higher regard. Good Omens captures the charm of its source material. That's a great example of an adaptation probably done well. Castlevania is a kind of adaptation and shares similar fast and loose writing styles, but manages to maintain a far more interesting presence. I can say that it is certainly better than Aragon, at least, but that's not saying much. Even if we aren't considering it as an adaptation, but just as a show on its own on Netflix, it still doesn't really stand up to its contemporaries. Like, there's so much popular stuff coming out right now. Who wants to watch The Witcher when you could watch Squid Game, Midnight Mass, Arcane, some episodes of Black Mirror? The point of all these comparisons is to show that the Witcher Netflix show, it's nothing special, but it's not the worst of the worst. If it isn't clear thus far, the conclusion I'm coming to is that the Witcher Netflix show is definitely the weakest of the three main adaptations, but it certainly has potential. Episode 5 of Season 1 and Episode 1 of Season 2 are actually pretty good, not only as adaptations, but just as good storytelling. Funnily enough, the show's biggest downfall can be shown in one of these episodes, though. Episode 5 of Season 1, there is a change made to the story's opening. Rather than having Geralt and Dandelion fishing in a lake, whereupon they accidentally discover a djinn from which the story develops, Geralt is in the show shown looking for a djinn in a river because he just happens to know that there is one, and Jaskier stumbles across him by coincidence.
Geralt! Hello. What's it been? Months? Years? What is time, anyway? I heard you were in town. Are you following me, you scamp?
This is a great example of how the show creates far weaker scenes than in the book by creating their own. The act of finding the djinn by coincidence, fishing together as friends, shows the relationship between Geralt and Dandelion in the books, rather than in the show where they just tell us about it and have Jaskier turn up and be affected by the djinn. Rather than leaning on the theme of destiny and fate like the books do, the show tries to put its own flair on the scene by changing the circumstances to something far more nonsensical. In doing so, substituting good writing for bad. I've said it before and I'll say it again, if you're going to change a scene, make sure that it's as good as the original content. So now obviously the debate would be between what is better, the books or the game. I'm going to be kind of possibly unpopular here when I say that I think the games supersede Sapkowski's works. The nature of the books and their medium feel much better for telling the story and showcasing certain themes. It's all well and good to have a well-written journey of Geralt, but he's a very bland character in a lot of ways, kind of the perfect protagonist in that way, especially for an RPG when you're making the choices for him where he could go either way canonically. Not only this, but the moral grey choices are far less interesting when you're reading them as a static observation. I would rather choose to reverse the curse onto the one who cast it, killing them and having to deal with the ramifications of my choices, rather than just reading about how Geralt justifies his actions. Ultimately, it's reasons like this that put Witcher 3 ahead of its source material, just because I think that video games are better positioned to tell a story where heavy choices are being made and the player has to justify them, rather than a character in a book. But hey, I guess Sapkowski shouldn't have made a world that was better suited for video games. No one tell him though, I think he'd be mad. It's a few days later, and I'm not really sure how to end the video, although I did realize that I didn't, definitively say how they're ranked. So just to make it absolutely clear, Witcher 3, the books. Way down here is the Netflix's Witcher. The video was a bit more serious than I was thinking it would be, but hey, it is what it is. So I think I'm going to try to make a few more lighthearted things if anyone cares and feels like sticking around.